Well, political commentator with Young Voices UK, Georgia Gilholy, joins us in the studio. Good to see you this morning. Look, in all of this, it's all about the spin a little bit, isn't it? Did the Conservatives do as badly as some might have expected? Did Labour fail to punch through? I mean, what's your analysis of this, of the results now we're getting them all through?
I think the headline really is that, OK, Labour in some ways have an open goal and they didn't necessarily do as well as they could have done, but they don't necessarily need to do as well as they could do to oust the Conservatives at the next general election. And so what we saw today were many councils falling to Labour, falling to the Lib Dems in a lot of sort of marginal southern areas. Obviously, Westminster and Wandsworth going to to Labour, of course, when they've been Conservative for a very long time. And I think this does not bode well for the next general election, because thinking forward, in terms of the economy especially, are things going to get better for the government? It's hard to see how, with inflation soaring, the crisis in Ukraine. Boris Johnson likes to say, OK, we're dealing with difficult issues. People want us to get on with the job. But I think when people are looking at their pay packet and then they're looking at food prices and energy prices, it's not translating through that the government are actually tackling those issues. Obviously, the government can't solve everything, it can't solve global energy issues, but that's not necessarily what people are thinking when they're going to be voting in 2024.
It's interesting, as all sorts of political commentators yesterday were trying to project yesterday's result into a general election type result, and most seemed to come up with what would effectively be a hung parliament, and it was arguable as to who would win the most seats. But then you can't really compare the two, can you? I mean, very low turnout for a start yesterday.
Yeah, of course, with local elections you always have a much lower turnout compared to general elections, because obviously people see general elections more important, which arguably in many ways they are. And then, of course, when it comes to locals, there are local issues, say planning issues, local services. I know many people who they may even vote Labour for their local councillor and Tory at a general election because they say, oh, I know, the local Labour guy, he helps with this, he helps with that. So it certainly doesn't translate. But obviously, in terms of the general picture, it's a useful way of sort of projecting of what might happen.
Does it keep the pressure on a little bit? I mean, for all parties, in terms of things like the cost of living crisis, where people are in desperate straits, and as you said, it's going to get worse before it gets better, potentially a lot worse. And yet still there is no movement on. I mean, Labour talks about a windfall tax, which may work, may not, I don't know. There's a lot of pressure on the Tories over things like the Green Levy, which obviously, and they're refusing to budge. Could this actually push the parties to actually come up with some concrete solutions?
I mean, when it comes to the Conservatives, they've been in government for over a decade. Obviously, we've seen a lot of change of leadership and a lot of turmoil during that time, so it's not sort of been a straight and narrow for them. But I think when people are thinking about the energy prices, even though, energy prices, for example, it's a global issue. They're rising globally because of post-COVID bounce back, because of the crisis in Ukraine. Though they were rising well before the crisis in Ukraine, I think people are thinking, well, you've had over a decade to deal with this, to shore up UK's energy security. Even though we don't, for example, import tons of gas from Russia, it affects the price of gas. So why are we relying on gas and why are we relying on importing gas? And I think that at least as outsiders somewhat, Labour has more of an angle to sort of argue that they're better at dealing with it. When it comes to something like the Green Levy, though, it's not going to look good for most average voters that the Tories won't get rid of it. But it really doesn't make that much of a difference in terms of the energy prices, because the reason they're rising is because of wholesale gas prices, unfortunately.
Do you think Beergate had anything to do with the reason that Keir Starmer didn't do quite as well as he might have hoped?
I mean, I think that's one way of looking at it. And I think that sort of looking at the news cycle yesterday, I think it's more that could be an issue going forward, because this kind of Beergate thing, I think, lots of maybe Conservative voters, maybe traditional Labour voters who might have voted Brexit are eager to criticise it. And I think, to be honest, from Keir Starmer's statements in the past, it does look like hypocrisy, because he's doing similar things to what Boris Johnson has been found guilty of doing in Downing Street, and what he may have done, because there may still be more fines to come. I think that maybe a small dent. I think it possibly didn't impact it that much because it hadn't sort of escalated to that point until after the polls had closed on Thursday. But I think that this could be a big issue for Keir Starmer going forward.
How big do you think? I mean, certainly the police seem to indicate that they deliberately kept away from saying too much till after the elections because of the rules. around all these sort of things. Do you think this is going to get pretty bad? Because, I mean, they have talked about significant new evidence coming forward.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what that evidence is. And obviously we've seen, you know, many headlines and front pages over the past few weeks to do with this. And I think that, you know, this could even lead to Keir Starmer resigning. There's sort of rumblings of people who could replace him. And there's certainly a more sort of adequate front runners in Labour right now on the front benches than there are on the Tories.
Sorry, just come in there. Do you think he would have to resign if he was found guilty and maybe issued some sort of a fine? Because he has made it such an issue, calling for the Prime Minister's resignation. If he himself is fined, and of course we don't have any idea, he'd have to resign himself, wouldn't he?
I mean, obviously that's an issue for him to decide. However, he did, in fact, at one point actually say that Boris Johnson should resign or possibly resign because he was under investigation. So it'd be interesting to see.
So we may already be in that position.
I mean, yeah, who knows? He could be packing his bags right now.
Yeah, OK. Look, Georgia, really good to talk to you this morning. Thank you.
Great to be here. Thank you.